In this video, we're going to focus on the edit page within our application. So at this point, we've built a home page, a quizzes page that shows all the quizzes, and a play quiz page that allows us to play individual quizzes, but we don't have any way to edit or create new data in our application. That's what the edit quiz is going to allow us to do. So we'll be able to edit existing quizzes, which will include deleting existing quizzes, and we'll be able to create brand new quizzes within the platform. So once we finish that, we will have the basic CRUD operations fully implemented in our platform. So that means create, read, update, delete. Those are the basic operations you have to do with persistent data, which is what we've got with Firestore here. So when we finish that, we will have something that looks like this, where we'll have the ability to load up all of the info from one of our quizzes and edit it, change the settings for different fields, add, remove questions, edit existing questions, and save and delete the whole quiz. This is a lot, so we're going to split this up over a couple of videos. In the first one, in this video, I just want to focus on the database logic of updating and deleting data through Firestore in our custom hook. And then in the next video, we'll focus on actually building out this form so that we have something that makes it pretty easy to edit the quiz within our application. So what I have pulled up here is the previous code that we worked on in the last video. So you can work from that code, or you can download the starter files. Just make sure you fill in your Firebase credentials and you do an npm install if you're using those starter files. So I should have this up and running already and npm installed. So we're going to do a couple of things in here. One, we want to create a new page within our application that'll look something like this, where we can go to edit quiz and then some ID, and that should allow us to grab the data for that ID so that we could start loading it into a form and editing it. We also want to make sure that the user, they can only go to this page if they're logged in. We don't want anonymous users to be able to create and edit quizzes in our platform. So we'll talk about authenticated routes. And then we'll kind of hook all of that together with our useQuizOnce hook and allow it to update and delete data from our database. So let's start with getting this route working. So I'm going to head to my app here, and what I want to do is create another route that looks like this. So I'm going to copy and paste this, and we're going to change this to edit quiz. So we learned last time that with React Router, you could have these parameters inside of your route path, and that allowed you to capture anything that could be typed in here. So I could go to any ID, and then that ID would be available to me, like on our play page here, using the params hook from React Router. So this made the ID variable accessible to us within our component. So we're going to do a really similar thing here for our edit quiz page. So I've got my route set up, and I need to now create a new folder in my application called edit quiz and put an edit quiz page in here. And I'm going to have it return a main. And let's make sure that we export default the edit quiz page. And let's actually put an H1 in here, edit quiz. So we should be able to mount that component here. And I am using the code actions here to actually import for me edit quiz page. So my 404 should now be gone, and I can see edit quiz. So this structure works well for editing when we know the ID, but I also want this page to work when we're creating a new quiz. So we can sort of just use the same form, same structure, same saving and deleting logic for those new quizzes that are created. And the way that we're going to do this is if someone goes to /new here, so the ID is new, we will create a new quiz in this component, And if they go to a specific ID, we will use that ID to look up the location in our database where this quiz is stored. So we don't have to do anything special here. We're still just capturing a variable. It is either going to be a valid ID from our database, or it's going to be the sort of special string of new. So back in our edit quiz page, let's grab the ID using the params hook from React Router. And I also want to create a Boolean variable is new that is true if our ID is equal to new. And then we can put this on our page. So let's say the param ID is ID. And we'll throw a paragraph on here. Is this a new quiz? Question mark. And we can use a ternary conditional operator. So if is new is true, then let's put yes on the page. Otherwise, we'll put no on the page. So with our parameter filled in with a number, a random gibberish number, this is not a new quiz. And then as soon as I go to /new, we should see our parameter is new and this is a new quiz. So we've got the skeleton here of routing for the edit quiz page. So this looks good. If we flip back here, there are a couple of things that we're going to need in this page, in this component, to actually implement our logic. One, we're going to need the quiz ID. And that's either going to come from the parameters here, or if it's a new quiz, we'll have to generate a random new quiz ID, and we'll do that through the Firebase library. We're then also going to need the quiz data. And, if we're creating a form on here for editing a specific quiz, we need to grab the data that's there and load it into that form so that we can edit it. And we're also going to need the user, more specifically, the user ID. And that will let us know whether this person is the owner of the quiz and whether they're allowed to edit this resource inside of our application. So this is going to come from our hook, our params hook here, or it'll come from us generating a random ID. This is going to come from our useQuizOnce, and that'll also be how we can update and delete data from Firebase through that hook. And we're also going to need the useUser hook, which gives us access to the ID. Because we're doing user-based logic on this page, I just want to make sure that my app doesn't even let anyone get to this page unless they are logged in. So what we're going to create is an authenticated route or a protected route inside of our application that makes sure that edit quiz page can only be loaded if you are currently logged in. So there are a number of ways that we can do that. We could do some of that logic directly in here using the useUser hook. But that would mean that anytime we wanted a protected route, we would have to add a bunch of logic to our components to make sure that they're guarded against the user not being logged in. So that would muck with our single responsibility principle. So I actually want to create a new component. And if we look back at our route here, what I want to do is have a special type of route, a protected route or an authenticated route that allows us to keep this structure, and then it will conditionally, based on whether or not you're signed in, show this content or show a message that says, hey, you need to log in. So what we're going to do is create a new component here, and we're going to create it in common, and I'm going to call it Authenticated Route. And create the stub of this. Let's just have it return nothing for a second here and export itself. I'll bring this side by side. So I want authenticated route to basically act exactly as an existing route in our application, except that it has some extra logic around the children. So that it only shows the children when the user's logged in. So here, we're going to need a couple of properties. We're going to want the children. Let me just rearrange things here. Is signed in, and we'll grab every other prop that gets passed in using the spread operator, or sorry, the rest operator here. Let me close the sidebar so that we can see more of this at once. So the children property, that's something from React. So whatever we pass in as a child of our authenticated route, like this paragraph here, that's going to show up as our children. Is signed in is going to be a custom property that we're specifying here. So that's going to be true or false based on whether or not the user is signed in. And we have that information for us already in this component here from the user state. So we know whether the user signed in or not. And then any other property that we pass in will be captured in this object. So that means that if we specified that something was exact or it had a path, these are going to be captured into our props object up here, or route props object, so that we can pass them along. So what we're going to basically be doing here is not returning a fragment, but returning a route. And this route is going to have all of those properties spread onto it. So whatever we pass in other than is signed in is going to be passed into our route. And this route is going to either show children or some placeholder message that tells you to log in. So based on whether or not we are signed in, we're returning children or a message, and let's just put as a paragraph, please sign in. So let's update this. This is we can remove the exact and path, and I want to grab this path. This is what we want to pass on to our route. And then instead of a paragraph that says, hey, let's put the edit quiz page here. So if this Boolean is true, that means we'll see edit quiz page because the children are being rendered here. Is signed in is true, so the children gets placed within the route. If that is false, then we should see this please sign in message show up in our application. So let's test that out. Back here on the edit quiz page, I'm just going to pop open my components view and let's close that and scroll down to our edit quiz page. Nope. Actually, those things we were doing here are in our switch. So we can see our authenticated route here, which renders a route, which then renders like all the stuff inside the route. So we can see our edit quiz page. If I head back to my authenticated route here and I go is signed in false, we should see please sign in. And when that flips to true, we actually see the contents of our page. So really simple authentication here. We're just using a Boolean on that route. Let's go back to full view here. So we're just using a Boolean on this is signed in prop to determine whether or not we can see the edit quiz page. And this path is being passed along as a property to our internal route that's inside of authenticated route. So what we should be able to do now is instead of directly specifying this Boolean, we could just grab is user state, or we could grab our user state and ask is signed in. And this is coming from our use user hook that we built a while ago. So that returns an is signed in Boolean that we can use. So if we're signed in, we should be able to get to this edit page. Currently, I'm signed in, so I can get to it. But if I sign out, and I try to go to /edit quiz, it says please sign in. And maybe to finish off this authenticated route, instead of just displaying please sign in, maybe we'll display something a little bit more involved here. So let's actually do this as another component that is local to this file, so not logged in. Content. And this will just be a simple component that returns a main that has an h1 of not logged in. And it'll have a message of you need to log in with your account or create a new account in order to access this page. And then we can drop in a link that says something like head to the home page. And I'm just going to make sure, save that so that it wraps, easier to see. And I'm going to make sure that I import link here. So this is just replacing the content here so that it's a little bit more informative than our paragraph. So we can just say not logged in content is what gets rendered if we are not signed in. And since I'm not signed in, we can see here's our message. We got our H1, need to log in, head back to the home page, and now we should be able to sign in with one of our accounts and head to edit quiz and any ID, and this loads. All right, so we have our authenticated route here. And if we were to continue to build this out and need some more flexibility, we might want to break this out into its own component. And it might be that your authenticated route could actually show different components. It could be like configured by another prop here that controls what's the component that gets shown when you're not logged in. I think this is fine for where our application is currently. So we've got our authenticated route. And because the structure of our app, the way we set it up, was that we display a loading spinner while Firebase is still trying to figure out whether a user has been logged in previously, and that user's information is stored persistently in local storage. And then when that resolves, we end up showing our switch here, which knows whether or not the user has been logged in. So we can use our authenticated route around any of these things, use our user state here. It also means that in our edit quiz page, if we bring in our user state using our useUser hook, we don't have to wait for the loading state. We've structured our application in such a way that when we get to this page, we are both logged in and Firebase has already done its like initial checking of local storage. So we don't have to listen for loading. We can just go grab the ID directly. So let's put that on the page here. We can grab the user ID, and that is in our user state.user ID. And let's also grab the user's name. And that is, I'm going to have to look back at our hook here. So we returned user ID is signed in. The user's name is stored in this object here. So user state.user.display name. And if we've structured things correctly, we should see the user ID here. This will be whatever your randomly generated user ID is, and your display name, which is pulled from your account info. So we've got the user. Let's get some of the quiz data. So we can use useQuizOnce and pass in our ID here. So whatever is coming in from the URL bar, we'll use to try to locate a quiz in our database. using this existing useQuizOnce hook. And we'll update this shortly so that it has a way to return methods that can update and delete the data. But for now, we're just using it as it is, which gives us an exists Boolean, the data, and our status of either loading, success, or error. So let's put that on the page here for debugging. Let's say the quiz status is quiz.status. And let's put the exists property here. Quiz exists. And let's throw, if we have data that has been loaded, then we'll put a pre-formatted element, PRE, that has the data stringified. So JSON stringify just allows us to take a object like quiz.data, the JSON object that we're going to get back from Firebase, and format it here. And I am passing in nothing for the replacer function, which allows us to kind of configure in a more advanced way how things get stringified. And I'm saying that it should use 2 spaces for tabs inside of that object. So if we have data, we'll throw that pre on the page. Otherwise, we will throw a paragraph that says no quiz data. So this is just for debugging. I'm not too worried about slowing down and explaining JSON stringify. Really, we're just printing some of this information about our quiz out on the screen. So when we load it here, we've got our user, we've got our param info pulled, and then we have our quiz information here. So the status is showing up as success, and there's no quiz data, and actually quiz exists. We can't just put a Boolean on the page. That won't actually render. So we need to use our ternary if it's true to say yes, if it's false to say no. And see here, quiz does not exist because we are on /new. But if we went back to our database and from the web console copied one of these IDs and placed it in here, we can see, yep, the quiz exists. It got to a status of success, and here's the giant dump of whatever is in that document. So what we want to do on this page to at least kind of test that our hook is working with our new features that we're going to build in a second is create some button that will allow us to delete the quiz and create some button that will allow us to update the data in the quiz. So delete and update here. So if we press update, we'll just make it modify maybe the title of the quiz, and if we hit delete, it'll delete the quiz. So to be able to start implementing that, we need to turn back to the Firebase documentation. So I have a bookmark here. Whoops. This is just under their documentation for Firestore. And under the add and manage data, there's a page for adding and there's a page for deleting. So adding data here, there are actually 2 ways, well, there are more than 2 ways to create a document in your database or update document in your database. So there is the set method here, which allows you to, after you've got a path to a document, just override whatever's there with some new data. So that'll work whether that, LA object or LA document exists or not. This is going to kind of just directly override what's there. There is an option that we will use called merge, which allows you to say that this should do a selective update. So if the document already exists, it will only touch the capital field. It will only change the capital field. It won't override other fields. And if it doesn't exist, it will create it with the capital of true. So we're going to end up using this And I just want to point out that if you head down to the updated document section, there is also an update method that does something very similar to the merge version of the set method. So that's adding, that's adding, updating, and deleting. They're all promise-based, so they'll be pretty familiar for us to work with. And there's also deleting, which is even simpler. We just need to get a reference to a document, call the delete method, and that gives us a promise that resolves to nothing or errors out. So with that, we should be able to start implementing this into our application here. And when we're thinking about how we want to implement this, it would be nice if our quiz just returned a way for us to set. Oops, let's try to undo that because it doesn't exist. My IntelliSense was giving me a different autocomplete. So we just want to have like a way for us to set the title and the description of a quiz. And it would be also nice if we had a delete method that allowed us to just delete the quiz. And that should hook into the existing status. So if we start setting it, it should let us know that we're updating. And if we go ahead and delete something, it should let us know that we're in that deleting state. So we can just work with the useQuizOnce hook that we already have and return something that allows us to set. I'm just going to put a placeholder function here and delete. And one note, delete is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So if you're ever thinking that you might want to destructure what's coming back here instead of capturing it into an object, you would have to then explicitly rename that as you're doing the destructuring, or you could decide that you're fine with just calling this delete quiz instead of delete. I'm not going to use destructuring. When I'm using my quiz, I'm kind of always using it as an object and saying quiz.status, quiz.exists, quiz.delete, quiz.set. So I'm fine with having this named as a reserved keyword because it's a property within that object. So what we can do is create the function here for setting a quiz, and create a function here for deleting a quiz. And these are what we are going to pass back here. So set quiz and delete quiz. So we could put in a message here, console log, and then back in our edit page, when we go to delete something, we could say on click, we call quiz.delete. And when we click on update here, we'll call quiz.set. And let's pass in a title of testing update. So our delete doesn't need any information passed into it, so we can just use quiz delete directly here. And our update actually does need some data passed into it to know what to actually change in our quiz. So we should be able to, with this, at least see that these buttons call our methods from our hook. So clicking delete should print out deleting, clicking update should print out setting. So now we could actually work on the logic and we'll build these one at a time. The deleting is the easier of the two, so let's build that one first. We're going to mark this as async, so this function can now use await within it because we're doing asynchronous logic. And basically what we're going to do is before we start, we need to change our quiz state so that the status is deleting. Then we need to try awaiting the delete and catch errors and update the quiz state accordingly. So we want to do something like this with the status of deleting when we kick things off. But what I want to do is I don't want to override the snapshot or error state here. So this was the structure of our state before, where we had the status, snapshot, error. And when you want to partially update things, it's not good for us to just reach in and grab the state here or grab these local variables that we've got and pass them into the object, because those may be stale. The better way to do this is using the functional form of the setter, which gives you the previous object here as the first parameter. So what I can do is say that I want to spread everything from the previous state into our new object here, but just modify the status to be deleting. So I am not getting rid of the existing snapshot. We might also want to say, like, when we start this new operation, let's assume that there's no error. So maybe I'll override that too. But my snapshot is not being overridden in this update. So we set up that so that we can do our try-catch structure around our asynchronous action. So in the try, we can do what we saw in the browser. So this is a promise, so we're going to await it, and we're talking to the quizzes collection, and we're saying give us the document that corresponds to whatever's passed in here, which we called quiz ID. It looks really similar to this line of code. And then instead of get, you call delete. So this will try to delete that resource. If it's successful, then we can do an update here where in this case, we do want to take control over all of the fields in our state, so we don't have to use the functional form here. We can say that the status is deleted, there is no error, and the snapshot is now null. So if I'm setting all of the fields, then it's fine to use the non-functional form. As soon as I want to make state dependent on the last state, I want to use the functional form of state updating. So we wait for the delete, and then in our catch here, we can do our common practice of logging the error so that we can actually see it as developers when we open up the dev tools. And let's set the quiz state when there's an error to have a status of error. And we will pass in the error object here. And then when this goes wrong, I probably don't want to remove the snapshot. So this is another case where the functional form of updating would be useful. So I'll do this, and at the beginning here, I will spread the previous state. So this will bring over the previous snapshot value, and then I'm overriding the status and error. So I think that should be it for us to get our delete quiz working here. If I save it and flip back to the browser, maybe what I'm going to do is try to remove this from the page so that we can actually see the buttons right next to the printout of the status. So let's head back to the edit quiz page, and I'll comment this out in case we want to bring it back later. Okay, so we have our status here. This quiz exists. This is our beginner-friendly JavaScript quiz here. Actually, for testing, let's create a new one that has a title of test quiz and save it. And I'm going to use this ID here when I go to delete something from my database. So if I click on delete, we should see the status update, deleting to deleted. The quiz no longer exists. And if I go to my Firebase console, that quiz that we just created is gone. And I could easily do that again. New test quiz. And grab this ID and bring these side by side. So that's the ID I want to use. Paste that in, delete, and we can see that got deleted from our database. So with the delete implemented in our hook, we could now focus on the set. So the way we want to use set is that we're going to pass in a new object to our set command that has all the data. So the title, the description, the difficulty, the questions, anything else we want to set. So our set quiz function, it'll be asynchronous and it will take in the new quiz data. We could call this new quiz data. And this function is going to have a really similar flow where we're going to set the quiz state here. Then we're going to have a try and a catch. And in the try, we also need to set the quiz state. And in the catch, we also need to set the quiz state. And we'll fill those in a second. The operation that we want to do is very similar to this line. So we're getting a reference to our document. That's what this does. And then we can call the set and pass in the new quiz data here. So this is what we saw in the documentation. So this form of doing set is going to just blow away whatever is at this ID and replace it with this data. I find that for our purposes, it would be more useful rather than completely overriding doing the merge. So I'm going to pass in merge of true. So when we call set, it's not going to delete things that we don't specify. So if we just want to conditionally update like the description, we can just pass in an object that has description. This will only touch the description for this document. If we want to make this more advanced, we could actually pass in the options here as a second parameter. I'm just going to try and keep things really simple for us starting out and just always make this do the merge operation. So when we go to set the quiz state here, I want to do something similar to what we did for delete. So we're using the functional form of an update that preserves the previous values and overrides the status to be updating and removes any errors. So that really means that our snapshot doesn't change when we do this operation. When our promise resolves successfully here, I want to do a similar thing. We're saving that previous snapshot that we had, and we're overriding the status to be success and the error to be null. And then when we catch an error, we're actually going to do these two lines of code. We're going to console log it, and we are going to set our status to error, store the error, and keep our previous snapshot. So what you may notice in this is that our snapshot here, going from updating to success, does not change. This is not a hook that does real-time updates of the quiz. Doesn't do real-time updates of this quiz data. So we could build a version that does real-time updates if we need it, but actually in the context of our quiz platform, we don't really need real-time updates. So we're not touching that here, and that'll simplify some of our logic. Okay, so we set to update. If that resolves correctly, we're in success. Otherwise, we're in error. And this has added a new status that we can potentially listen for. So we know when it's in loading, it's doing the initial fetching, and when it's in updating, it's trying to do some kind of save operation on the data. So we should be able to test this now with an ID in our URL, and then clicking on update, it should set just the title to be testing update. So let's bring back our side-by-side view here. I'm going to create a new quiz that has a title of 1, 2, 3 and has a description of this is a test, and grab this ID here and go to it, and we can see success, it exists. And if I click update, it should change just the title, even though we are only passing in the title here. When we do our set, it is doing the merge version of set, so we don't override existing data. So that works. And if we went back in here and said testing update and added some 2s and clicked update, that should work again. And so this should work for any ID that we pass in that corresponds to a document in our database. So we have deleting and we have setting. We need to hook this up to a form in the next video to actually make this usable. Like this needs to come from some kind of editable form for updating. Otherwise, setting is not helpful at all. But what I want to do before we wrap this up is actually handle the situation when you went to a new ID. So if we go to /new in our application and we try to do an update, what's going to happen is that it's going to try and create a new document called new. And we don't want that to happen. When you go to new and you update, we actually want a new auto incremented ID added here to our quizzes collection. So let me delete this. There are a couple of ways that we could do this. What I want to do is use the Firestore ID tools, or the auto incrementing ID built into Firestore. So if I head back to my Firebase file here that's in data, I want to export a helper function here that will give me a new ID. So get new quiz ID. And what this should return is just db.collection_quizzes.doc without a parameter and then ID. So this is how we can create a new document reference to something in our database that doesn't exist, and then we're just grabbing the ID from it. So this will give us a new ID generated by Firestore for us. And then we could export this, get new quiz ID. And actually, this is a small enough function that we could just make it a one-liner here as an arrow function. So this, if we go back to our edit quiz page here, we can use this function to get a new quiz ID. We're in a situation where basically using these two pieces of information, we either want a new quiz ID or we want to use the ID from the parameter, the URL parameter. So what we're going to do here is create a new piece of state, and we'll call this quiz ID. And this is either going to be, well, let's do this more simply here. If it's new, then we will go ahead and call our get new quiz ID. Otherwise, we will just use the ID from our parameter bar, from our URL bar. So this is a state variable that gets initialized based on whether we're at /new. If we're at /new, it's this new quiz ID. Otherwise, it's the existing one from the URL bar. And then we can use this quiz ID here when we're grabbing something from our quiz. So this should now, if I go ahead and bring these up side by side, if we go to /new, we should see we're successfully connected with that document reference and there's nothing there. And if I hit update, we'll see that a new thing has been added using a randomly generated ID according to the kind of Firestore algorithm for generating these IDs. And if I go to /new again and hit update, we get a brand new one in here. So let me delete some of these so that we don't end up with a bunch of cluttered, useless data. And if we flip back to our edit quiz page, I just want to highlight that we can't just call this here. If we call it here outside of our use state initialization, that means that we're getting a new one every time edit quiz page renders. But if we pass it in as the initial state to the state hook, this is a quick way for us to store just the initial value. So either this gets called once and that gets stored here, or it's this ID. And if we want to make an optimization rather than letting this be run every time our component renders, if we wrap this in a function, we do the kind of lazy initialization of state. So this function only runs once when the component is mounted. So let's get rid of this comment here and just verify that everything's still working. So let's refresh this here. So we're at /new, click update, that gets created. And if I click delete without leaving this page, that gets deleted. And we should be able to still go here to existing ones. So I'm just gonna grab one here, update it. The title has been changed, and I can get rid of my testing data. Make sure that we've got a clean set of quizzes in here. All right, so I know it doesn't look like much currently, but actually what we implemented with the delete and update buttons here, that's the core of what we need to then move on to the next version that actually lets us edit the data. So what we'll do next is hook up what we created with the edit and delete functionality to a form that allows you to actually, through a user interface, type in a new title and then save it. So wrapping up here, we created a new route. It uses the params hook from React Router. We made this a protected route so that you can only get here if you're logged in. And then we added that update and delete functionality within our application. And next time we'll add in the form.